You've been poisoned, shot at, bombed, and betrayed by the most powerful country on earth. 638 times they tried to kill you, and 638 times you survived. This is your life as Fidel Castro. You're born on August 13th, 1926, on a sugar plantation in eastern Cuba. Your father is a Spanish immigrant who carved a farm out of the jungle with his bare hands. He's rich now, rich enough to own land, hire workers, and send you to the best schools on the island. But you're not legitimate. Your parents aren't married yet. The other children at school call you a bastard. You respond with your fists. You're tall for your age, strong, the kind of kid who'd rather fight than walk away. At school in Santiago, you challenge a teacher who hits you. They send you to a Jesuit boarding school in Havana. The priests teach you discipline, but you don't learn obedience. You learn debate. You learn how to argue until the other person gives up. You learn how to make people listen. You're 19. You enroll at the University of Havana to study law. But the university isn't about law, it's about politics. Student gangs carry guns openly on campus. Two rival groups fight for control, and people die in the hallways. You carry a gun too, a 15-shot Browning that never leaves your side. You sleep with it under your pillow. You join every protest, every rally, every fight that matters. You're not afraid of anyone. You never will be. In 1947, you join an expedition to overthrow the dictator of the Dominican Republic. The plan falls apart before you reach the shore. Your boat is intercepted, but you jump into the ocean with your gun and swim to land. You're 21 years old, and you've already learned something that will define the rest of your life. Even when the plan fails, you survive. You marry Mirta Diaz-Balart. Her family is wealthy, connected to the government. For a brief moment, you have a normal life. A son, Fidelito, an apartment in Havana. But you can't sit still. You don't want a normal life. You want to change everything. Your country is controlled by a man named Fulgencio Batista. He seized power in a military coup, and now the island belongs to everyone except the people who live on it. You walk past casinos run by American gangsters. You see sugar fields owned by corporations in New York. You know that Batista's secret police drag people from their homes at night, and Washington sends them the weapons to do it. You decide this has to end. Not with votes. With bullets. July 26, 1953. You lead 160 men in an attack on the Moncada barracks in Santiago. It's supposed to be a surprise. It's a disaster. The soldiers are waiting. Your men are gunned down in the streets. 61 of them are captured and executed afterward, beaten to death, shot in their cells. You escape into the mountains with 2 others, but they find you 6 days later, asleep in a farmhouse. A lieutenant named Sarria arrests you. His commanding officer calls on the radio and orders him to kill you on the spot. Sarria refuses. He looks at you and says, "You cannot kill ideas. You're put on trial. They expect you to beg. Instead, you defend yourself. You stand in front of the judges and speak for 4 hours without a single note. You list every crime Batista has committed. You describe every family destroyed, every body found on the roadside. You end with the words that will follow you for the rest of your life. Condemn me. It does not matter. History will absolve me." The judges sentence you to 15 years. You serve less than 2. You're sent to the Isle of Pines prison, a white circular building where every cell faces a central tower. The guards can see you at all times. But prison doesn't break you. It makes you sharper. You read everything you can get your hands on. Marx, Lenin, José Martí, Victor Hugo. You organize the other prisoners. You write letters. You plan. You call your movement the 26th of July after the day you attacked Moncada. Even behind bars, you're recruiting. Batista makes a mistake. He grants amnesty to look merciful. You walk out of prison on May 15th, 1955, and you're more dangerous than when you went in. You go straight to Mexico. In a small apartment in Mexico City, you meet a 27-year-old Argentine doctor named Ernesto Guevara. Everyone calls him Che. He's read more Marx than you have. He's angrier than you are. You like him immediately. You buy a yacht called the Granma. It's built for 12 people. You load 82 men on board, along with rifles, ammunition, and enough food for 7 days. On November 25th, 1956, you set sail from Mexico. The crossing is supposed to take 5 days. It takes 7. Everyone is seasick. Half your men are vomiting over the side. The boat takes on water.
You run out of food on day 6. You land on the wrong beach, a mangrove swamp on the southeastern coast. Your men are wading through chest-deep mud, carrying their rifles above their heads. Batista's Air Force spots you within hours. Within 3 days, your 82 men are scattered across the jungle. Most are killed or captured. You're left with 12. 12 men, 7 rifles, and the Sierra Maestra Mountains. That's everything you have in the world. But it's enough. You disappear into the jungle. The peasants in the mountains have never owned their land. They've never seen a doctor. Che treats their sick children.
You sit with the old men and promise them the land they've been working for someone else their entire lives. They bring you food, information, and eventually their sons. Your 12 become 50. 50 become 300. 300 become a guerrilla army that Batista's soldiers cannot find, cannot fight, and cannot stop. You learn to fight in the mountains. You ambush convoys on narrow roads. You hit army outposts at dawn and vanish before reinforcements arrive. Your men carry everything on their backs. You sleep in hammocks strung between trees. The jungle is your fortress. When Batista sends 1,000 soldiers to sweep the Sierra Maestra, you split into small columns and let them chase ghosts. A New York Times reporter named Herbert Matthews hikes into the mountains to find you. You have only 18 men at this point, but you march them in circles past his position so it looks like a regiment. Matthews writes that you command a large, well-equipped force. The article runs on the front page. Overnight, you go from a wanted criminal to a romantic revolutionary. Volunteers flood in from the cities. Students, teachers, factory workers. They want to fight for you. For 2 years, you fight in those mountains. You sleep on the ground. You eat what the peasants eat. You lose friends in ambushes you set, and ambushes that were set for you. But Batista's army is rotting from the inside. His soldiers don't want to fight. His officers are stealing the payroll. His American backers are sending nervous telegrams. On New Year's Eve, 1958, Batista empties the national treasury into a plane and flies to the Dominican Republic. He doesn't even say goodbye. You march into Havana on January 8th, 1959. The streets are flooded with people. They're cheering, crying, climbing on your jeep, reaching for your hand. You're 32 years old, and you just took a country with 12 men, 7 rifles, and a promise. But taking power is the easy part. Keeping it is where the killing starts. You hold trials in stadiums. The accused are Batista's police, his informants, his torturers. Thousands of people pack the seats and scream, "Paradon, not to the wall." You give them what they want. Hundreds are executed by firing squad in the first months. The cameras are rolling. You don't hide it. You don't apologize. You nationalize the sugar mills. You take the land back from United Fruit. You seize the oil refineries from Texaco and Shell. You close the casinos, kick out the American mobsters, and tell Washington that Cuba is no longer for sale. The response comes fast. The United States cuts diplomatic relations. They impose an embargo. And then they come for you directly. April 1961. 1,400 Cuban exiles land at the Bay of Pigs. The CIA trained them. The CIA armed them. The CIA promised them air cover. You're waiting for them. Your soldiers surround the invaders on the beach. The air cover never comes. Kennedy loses his nerve. Within 72 hours, it's over. You've captured over 1,000 men. You parade them in front of cameras. The most powerful country on earth just sent an army to your shores, and you crush them in 3 days. But their failure becomes an obsession. The CIA launches Operation Mongoose, the largest covert operation in the agency's history. Their mission: kill you by any means necessary. They put poison in your cigars. You smoke them every day. Your signature, your image. An agent delivers a box of your favorite brand, laced with botulinum toxin strong enough to kill you before you finish the first one. Someone tips you off. You don't smoke them. They send a woman. Marita Lorenz, your former lover, is recruited to slip poison pills into your drink. She hides them in her cold cream jar. The pills dissolve in the cream. When you see her, you hand her your pistol and say, "Did you come here to kill me?" She can't do it. They design an exploding seashell. You love to dive. You spend hours underwater off the Cuban coast. The plan is a conch shell packed with explosives, beautiful enough to catch your eye on the ocean floor. Too unreliable. They abandon it. They try a diving suit dusted with a fungus that would eat your skin, and tuberculosis bacteria packed into the breathing apparatus. The suit is never delivered. They try poison milkshakes. A pen rigged with a hypodermic needle so fine you'd never feel the prick, loaded with a nicotine poison called Black Leaf 40. They recruit mafia bosses, Santo Trafficante, Johnny Roselli, Sam Giancana, and promise them Havana back if they deliver your corpse. The mafia tries. The mafia fails. Everyone tries. Everyone fails. October 1962. You allow the Soviet Union to place nuclear missiles on your soil aimed at the United States. For 13 days, the world holds its breath. You watch American warships circle your island. Soviet submarines patrol below with nuclear torpedoes. You write a letter to Khrushchev urging him to launch first if the Americans invade. You'd rather see the world burn than surrender. Khrushchev blinks. He removes the missiles without asking you. You feel betrayed by the only ally you have left. But you survive. You always survive. The years pass. You consolidate power. You stand at the podium in your green fatigues, your beard thick and dark, your finger jabbing the air. No one alive can hold a room the way you can. You ban elections. You control the newspapers, the radio, the television. You tell yourself it's necessary. The revolution has enemies everywhere. You send your soldiers to Africa, to Angola, to Ethiopia, to Mozambique. 36,000 of your troops deploy to Angola to fight against apartheid's armies in southern Africa. Your men fight in jungles 8,000 miles from home. When the battle at Quito Cuanavale turns the tide against the South African military, the world takes notice. You're not just running a Caribbean island. You're projecting power across oceans. At home, you build hospitals and schools. Before you took power, most Cubans couldn't read. You launch a literacy campaign. 250,000 volunteers fan out across the island, teaching farmers and factory workers to read and write. Within a year, illiteracy is gone. You train so many doctors that you send them to other countries. 60,000 Cuban doctors working in 90 nations. The education is real. The health care is real. But so are the prisons. Anyone who disagrees with you is a counter-revolutionary. You arrest journalists, poets, homosexuals, priests. You put them in labor camps and call it rehabilitation. Thousands flee on rafts across the Florida Strait. Some make it to Miami. Many drown. The ones who leave hate you more than your enemies ever could, because they loved Cuba first. Your beard goes gray. Your friend Che left years ago to start revolutions in other countries. You warned him about Bolivia. He didn't listen. In October 1967, Bolivian soldiers capture him in a schoolhouse and shoot him the next morning. When you hear the news, you sit alone in your office. You don't speak for hours. The Soviet Union collapses in 1991. You lose 80% of your trade overnight. You call it the special period. The lights go out across the island. The food disappears. Your people eat whatever they can find. Stray animals, banana peels, boiled sugar water. There's no gasoline, so you ride a bicycle to the office. But you don't fall. Every analyst, every CIA officer, every exile in Miami says you'll be gone within months. You outlast them all. You watch American presidents come and go. Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Ford, Carter, Reagan, Bush, Clinton, Bush, Obama. 11 presidents try to break you. You stand at the podium and give speeches that last 4 hours, 5 hours, sometimes 7. Your voice doesn't crack. Your finger points at the camera. You're still here. You're always still here. On July 31st, 2006, you feel a sharp pain in your abdomen, internal bleeding. You undergo emergency surgery, and for the first time in 47 years, you hand power to someone else. Your brother Raul. The world watches your hospital window waiting for you to die. You don't die. You step back from public life. You write newspaper columns about everything. Agriculture, politics, baseball. You grow vegetables in your garden. You meet foreign leaders in a tracksuit instead of fatigues. Hugo Chavez visits, so does the Pope. The beard is white now, the hands are slower, but the eyes haven't changed. You've outlived every enemy who ever swore to destroy you. On November 25th, 2016, exactly 60 years after you sailed from Mexico on the Granma, your heart stops. You are 90 years old. 638 assassination attempts. 11 American presidents, a nuclear crisis, an invasion, a revolution that outlasted the Cold War itself. They tried poison, bombs, fungus, women, the mafia, exploding seashells, and a contaminated diving suit. And in the end, the only thing that killed Fidel Castro was time. If you want to experience the life of another person who refused to die, that video is right here. Subscribe if you haven't already.